Very happy to be joined as we keep the show going here by Mark Ames, who's a journalist, an author, and the co-host of the War Nerd podcast. Mark, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me on, and happy birthday, Rania.
Thank you.
I wish I had like
Amazing.
a bell or something.
I know, I wish we could just ding, ding, ding.
Ding.
It'd be like a
Ronnie's
Dan Patrick
birthday.
show. Well, you know, Mark, here we are yet again with another sort of Russiagate adjacent controversy taking over the front pages of many major newspapers here in the West. A lot of outrage being expressed in different ways. Maybe before we get into some of the broader controversy, if you could just really quickly, for those who maybe have been living under a rock, give a sense of why Belarus, Russia are in the news and why people seem so outraged about it.
Well, since last year, Belarus has been, large protests broke out last year after a extremely dubious election, yet another one that Alexander Lukashenko, who is the authoritarian leader. I mean, he's a dictator, and he's not good. He held, and he's been in power since 1994, and his crackdown since then has been unusually brutal. I would say that the opposition to him, unlike in earlier years, is very large, wide scale, and popular. And the crackdown was quite brutal. So that's kind of the background A. And background B is what was it? Just a couple days ago now, one of the opposition leaders, unfortunately, Roman Protasevich, who runs a very effective, especially during the protests. I mean, I used to watch it a lot. Nexta, it's like an online social media site, but quite effective in terms of organizing protests and keeping people worked up about protesting against Lukashenko. Anyway, he was flying from a meeting in Greece, I think a plane from Athens, Greece, to Lithuania, which is where a lot of the exiled opposition is based right now. And the plane was forced down over while it flew over Belarusian airspace. It was forced down under some BS pretext. I think they claimed that Hamas had phoned in a bomb threat, thinking the West will have to get behind us over that. Everybody's against Hamas. And the bad thing about the Hamas threat is that it gave a lot of hacks who do not want to look into Protasevich's own past. I mean, it's you couldn't write these scripts. Evil Putin couldn't write these scripts if you wanted to. Protasevich is a goddamn Nazi. I mean, one of the worst, actually. And this is what's so, on the one hand, you have a guy whose life is miserable right now. He's a young guy, ran this very effective operation. They wanted him to arrest him, to scare dissidents, to get all of the intelligence that they're definitely going to get from him. But he's a bad person, I mean, there doesn't always have to be two good people in a story.
Yeah,
right?
Nazis are bad.
Yeah, I think we can all agree Nazis are bad. So this guy, volunteered to serve with the Azov Battalion, which is, Azov Battalion has this global white supremacist neo-Nazi reach. A lot of shootings, even outside of, Nazi-inspired massacres, and activists outside of Ukraine have been very inspired by Azov. It's a terrorist group, and this is who he went to. He basically trained up with them, and then after that, he went from that to Radio Svoboda, Radio Liberty, and the Václav Havel. He was a Václav Havel fellow,
wow.
In Prague. I mean, it's you can't make this shit up. And when this first started to leak out, there were some really good, actually, Ukrainian emigre academics, Ivan Kachanovsky, Vladimir Ishchenko, were pointing, we're looking into this and saying this looks real. And of course, immediately, all these disinfo warriors jumped all over them, accused them of being conspiracy theorists, especially Ivan Kachanovsky. I mean, it was savage and really, I have to say, really just disgusts me and pisses me off. These are people who are supposed to be monitoring disinformation. What they really do is monitor information that is uncomfortable to NATO. and uncomfortable to people who've invested everything in demonizing Russia and getting the Cold War going. And so, eventually even Bellingcat admitted, yeah, the evidence is there. He served in a Belarusian unit with the Azov Battalion in 2014-15, which is when they were doing most of their killing. I mean, Azov Battalion was basically formed as a death squad because the regular Ukrainian army would not go into pro-Russian or Russian-speaking towns and villages and suppress them and kill them, basically. And so the army was pulled out, and they raised these so-called volunteer battalions. It's a classic death squad strategy. And Azov was the most fearsome because they're the most Nazified and, full of criminals and fascists, and even jihadists fought with them. So it's, it's a big problem. And what Westerners have decided to do is just pretend it didn't happen. You've seen, I saw in the Times UK, Mark Bennett's had a couple paragraphs on Protasevich's Azov ties and Nazi past. And when it started to leak out, he deleted it. Because the thinking is among these people, well, we can't do something that helps Lukashenko because he's bad. We can't tell our people the truth if the truth hurts our enemies or bad people, which is every dictator's reason for protecting, the public and having to censor, right? Except our journalists censor themselves.
Yeah.
So the whole
Mark,
thing.
you also, Mark, you also mentioned, I saw you tweet this, and this is a really good point, is that it's not as though there aren't other protesters that have been jailed by Lukashenko. Like they just decide to pick this neo-Nazi.
I guess because he was the one that was down in an airplane, and then you have to deal with the hypocrisy of the West.
Right.
Obviously, the Evo Morales plane was forced down. I mean, Obama didn't have to call in a Hamas threat to force it down because he could get NATO satellite states to lock down airspace and force it down in Vienna, and Snowden wasn't on the plane. Lukashenko doesn't have that power that Obama has, so he has to call in a Hamas block. I mean, it's so fucking ridiculous. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, look, Lukashenko has the Lukashenko regime, I hate that word, but I'm going to use it here, government, whatever, has stomped, arrested, beaten thousands of protesters, activists, journalists, opposition figures and people. And of all of them, of all those people, the one they have to choose, they're going to name a street. Romania announced that they're going to name a street after Protasevich. It's like all the streets named after Nazis that you have in post-Maidan Ukraine now.
Crazy.
Yeah. Michael McFaul, my old friend, going back to my exile days, who was the ambassador, he said, free Protasevich. Protasevich is a hero. We all must worship Protasevich. It's like, then, you just put it next to a photo of him. There are photos all over the internet, not only of him in his Azov uniform with the wolf's angle and the Azov patch. He did propaganda for them, right? He did propaganda for them and fought with them and got wounded in battle with them. These guys were not, these guys were death squads. That's what they were. And
it goes also back to what was actually happening in Ukraine, right? Because to acknowledge who this guy is and who he was fighting with would be to acknowledge that the people the U.S. is backing in Ukraine include in them elements of neo-Nazis, because the Azov battalion that you've been talking about has actually been the recipient of U.S. weapons. And that's been a huge controversy. Well, not a huge, it hasn't been as big a controversy.
Hasn't been nearly enough.
It's been a tiny controversy on Capitol Hill. But
it broke through a little bit.
Right. But this is the same, it's like the same tactic, it's like the Syria tactic, but in Ukraine, where you the rebels, the moderate rebels, but they're also a bunch of jihadists. In this case, there are a bunch of Nazis involved. And then whenever any of them complain, you turn them into a hero. Even wasn't that guy in a video with an ISIS flag? And in this case, it's wait, wasn't that guy in a video with a Nazi flag?
It's and there is a commonality there, because you remember how they would, the reality is Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, HTS, whatever they call themselves this week, they're the most radical, most extreme, most reactionary fundamentalists, and they fought best, right? I mean, none of these rebel groups were all that great at fighting, but they were the most effective fighters. They wanted to kill and murder and actually fight and blow themselves up. And that's the same with, I mean, this is the playbook with Ukraine too. The more Nazi you were, the more eager you were to murder Russian speakers. You saw them as subhuman animals who were, poisoning your great Ukrainian culture, and you want to murder them. Those are the best fighters. A lot of them didn't, like I said, the regular army was pulled out. They didn't fight. You need people. So Protasevich, his next is very effective, very good, and he was doing a lot of interviews. I mean, he's pretty courageous as fascists go.
You can't accuse him of not being brave, I suppose.
Yeah, no, actually, although on the other hand, he did break pretty quick. I mean, he was already doing the confession. Granted, I would do a confession and name everybody. Not saying I wouldn't, but if you're a Nazi, I mean, Assange hasn't done his confessions, and he's been in, so fucking Nazi, he could at least hold out for a few days, Mr. Nazi macho.
But there also is something to be said about there is something to be said about the fact that, Lukashenko, obviously not exactly a Democrat. This isn't democracy we're seeing in Belarus. At the same time, this doesn't have anything to do with democracy, right? It's the EU trying to strangle a country for being too close to Russia. Am I correct to say that?
No, I mean, I think what's fair to say is, I think the main thing to say here is that Belarusians are screwed. Because of where they are. They had it pretty good for a while under Lukashenko. Lukashenko came to power in 94 because Belarus did what Yeltsin did, and a lot of, and I think what Kravchuk probably did in Ukraine. Belarus's first leader did too. The shock therapy and all that stuff, and it was roundly rejected by Belarusians. And I would say Lukashenko was generally, in a kind of passive way, supported and not opposed until, I think it got worse. It just got worse over time. He's been in power so long. But the standard of living in Belarus up to a couple of years ago was high, plenty higher than in Ukraine, for example, like a lot higher. And what he did is he reversed a lot of the privatizations and kept the economy much more nationalized. He's a conservative. He's not like, Hugo Chavez or something. I mean, they I'm sure had common ground in some ways, and he's not a liberal in the economic sense. Lukashenko also, it needs to be pointed out, is not a Russian puppet. I mean, for that matter, Yanukovych wasn't a Russian puppet. It's really stupid, more propaganda that we get. And Lukashenko's not. And in fact, he's been a difficult ally for the Russians. I mean, if you were to say what's the Kremlin's sort of ideal with Belarus, is stability. And Lukashenko, the longer he stays there, I mean, they've been trying to get him out since about 2010. They actually tried to organize at least one time a kind of color revolution to get him out of there. And the West was supporting him. And the West constantly would go back and forth, and you had these McFaul dorks thinking, we can end the sanctions against Lukashenko and we can bring him on our side, split him off from Russia, and then we'll sort of throw in our NGOs and color revolution and so on. And Lukashenko would just kind of play ball back and forth. And even now, I mean, the Russians, I think, from everything I'm reading, even in the New York Times, even from the opposition, agrees the Kremlin is furious at him for downing that plane. Does nothing for the Kremlin. And you have freaks like Timothy Snyder, Yale's Holocaust revisionist, saying it's possible that this could only be done with Russia. And since it's possible, it's true. And since it's true, we must punish Russia over it and cancel the upcoming summit. So Russia definitely is not happy with that. And they're not sure how the hell to get rid of Lukashenko. But yeah, to your point, Rania, the West's strategic goal is to destabilize the place, to make it hard for Russia to govern it. If the West was the West, NATO, the US-led international order, whatever you're going to call it.
The rules-based international order.
The rules-based international liberal order, yeah. If they cared about Belarusians, they would say, we will groom people who will be neither, overly pro-Russian nor overly pro-Western, who will work with both sides. They'll be, they won't be hostile, and they'll try to do sort of very orderly transitions. But that's not in America's interest. That's not in NATO's interest. Russia is a rival. It's an adversary, and the interest is to destabilize Russia as much as possible by destabilizing the areas around it. And so we put money into Nazis and other radicals. Tsikhanovskaya, one of her top aides now, is a nationalist, Veronik Vyachkora, I think his name is. I mean, he has old ties to a lot of the similar kind of National Front type groups that Protasevich is involved in as well. Belarusian National Front groups, Youth Front, all this kind of crap. So I think, though, what is happening is the longer Lukashenko stays in power, the more he represses people, because Nazism is not popular in Belarus. I mean, they lost a quarter of their population to the Nazis. It's not been a historically hyper-nationalist place. They didn't have, like, the Western Ukraine. They didn't have any of that. Not for lack of trying. The West, NATO, the NGO structures have tried to, kind of instill that, and that's why somebody like Protasevich is so useful. But I would say that, the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that younger opposition people are going to be more radicalized. They're going to start diving deeper into Belarusian mysticism and fascism and anti-Russian ethno-nationalism, and it's just horrible. It's horrible and it's sad. And the other option is staying with Lukashenko, and he is just getting, exponentially worse by the week. And so they're kind of just they're screwed no matter what, it seems to me, and it's sad.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you're on Russia's border, I guess, true. And the U.S. I mean, that's crazy that the idea of stability, though, as you're describing it, it seems like, and this makes sense actually, because you can apply this logic to Syria as well, is Russia does want stability. I'm not saying they're the good guys all the time, but that is in their interest. Stability is in their interest, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you want the opposite of what Russia wants, then you just want to destabilize everything to hurt Russia. So sorry, Belarusians.
One thing that is also sort of sitting behind this for me is, we're in the midst of this so-called global conversation around anti-Semitism, and the whole media is like, people who are for Palestine, they all are just anti-Semitic. And it just, I don't know if it's through the looking glass, cognitive dissonance, but then you see on the other hand, here are the same people supporting these political forces in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet states that are actual Nazis.
Yeah, and I'd go almost a little bit worse. I've seen a lot of people on the left who, or on the putative left, whatever, who stylize themselves as anti-fascist and have been anti-fascist, and researching and exposing and going after the far right in this country and even abroad, even Azov Battalion, and also being anti-Russia and really buying into this narrative that, NATO is a progressive force. There's a lot of that in the progressive side, that NATO's a progressive force, and that, Putin is this sort of, octopus evil guy who's like he's sort of the head. I think it was one of Hillary's people called him the head of the alt-right Comintern, and they really want to believe that. And a lot of these disinfo warriors want to believe that. And here you have a situation where Protasevich, it's undisputable now that he was with the Azov Battalion. But you're having these same people who've been like screaming about Nazi hunting all the time on social media and through their research and through their papers and so on, saying, well, maybe he was, but he was a journalist. Yeah, like basically he makes Andy No, or however you pronounce that, look like Rachel Maddow. I mean, you're going to call him a journalist. Like Protasevich is, I don't think you call a guy who's suited up, armed, and got wounded in battle with the Azov Battalion, the most extreme, largest Nazi paramilitary group in the world, a journalist, right? And they're finding excuses for him, and they're coming out and saying, well, we can talk about his Nazi past later, but first we got to get him out of jail. As if Lukashenko's like, I don't know, not sure, but they're not talking about his Nazi past anymore. Okay, you can go free. Like, Lukashenko doesn't give a shit. This is only between us and what we're willing to talk about. And the reality is, when you suppress that and whitewash it, again, you create tankies. I mean, you subvert people's trust and belief in your narratives again, which is supposedly what Putin does, and you lose them. There's nothing to be gained by pretending that Navalny wasn't a xenophobe, and getting that out of the way, and then talking about why it's bad and good now or something. And there's nothing gained by covering up for Protasevich's Nazi past. It's real and it's bad and it's frightening.
It really is. I mean, I saw someone send me something, this is actually a few months ago, about Stepan Bandera in the Ukraine. And it was like, well, was he affiliated with the SS? Of course. Was he involved in the Holocaust? Absolutely. But he was a nationalist, not a Nazi. I mean, I don't even know what that distinction is, but it was just stunning to me that someone would even try to make that argument at that level. And it was, we were in a relatively civil conversation, but in service of basically saying, well, we should support Ukraine and we shouldn't even really be concerned about this glorification of this, SS individual.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say also is that what this showed with all these people on the left who stylize themselves as anti-fascist, anti-far right researchers, disinformation warriors, that when push came to shove, the most important thing for them was fighting America's rival, making sure, even willing to self-censor and suppress information about a goddamn Nazi, in order to help America's cause and hurt America's official state enemy. And that is messed up. You got to have some principles. So you're not principled actually about any of this far right stuff. What you're principled about is helping NATO and helping America. And this is like, I don't know. It's depressing. Yeah. Very depressing.
It is depressing. It is depressing. It's through the looking glass. It's outrageous. It seems like, what world am I living on? Well, Mark Ames, really appreciate you giving us some time. Really hope folks check out the War Nerd podcast. Fantastic podcast. You're also a journalist, author, great stuff all over the place. Really appreciate you being here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me on.